The episode we read as today's gospel appears only once a year in the Easter season, and even the lectionary slice we are offered is rarely preached on or even read as a whole. I just read it as a whole. It seems to comprise 2 or 3 separate and different stories or topics. First, the miraculous catch of fish, which sounds like a modified import from the public life of Jesus recounted in the synoptics. Second, Peter's rehabilitation through his triple affirmation of his love for Jesus after his triple denial of Jesus during the Passion, followed by his commissioning. However, not to exercise the so-called power of the keys, as in Matthew's gospel, but to shoulder the pastoral responsibility of tending and feeding Jesus' flock, which does not thereby become Peter's flock, but remains always and only in this gospel, the flock of Jesus. And even the longer reading in today's liturgy omits the final, very brief section of chapter 21, which is integral to its message, namely Jesus' dismissal of Peter's competitive concern about the fate of the beloved disciple. When Peter asks Jesus, "And what about him?" Jesus tells Peter that the relation of the beloved disciple to Jesus is not Peter's business. Peter has enough on his plate to develop his own relationship to Jesus and to tend the flock Jesus is committing to his care. Peter's primacy is one of responsibility and service, not a primacy of preference or power. Because the seemingly eclectic content of chapter 21, the mixtures of genre and literary form, and its tone and atmosphere are somewhat synoptic-like, at least on the surface, this chapter appears at first blush to be quite different from the rest of the Gospel of John. So the reader or hearer can be tempted to see this chapter 21 as some kind of afterthought, or even a kind of catch-all for material that didn't fit anywhere else in the fourth Gospel. John's account in chapter 20 of the discovery of the empty tomb, the resurrection appearances to Mary Magdalene in the garden, to the disciples gathered together in Jerusalem on Easter night, and again 1 week later to the disciples with Thomas the twin, who had missed the previous week's appearance, followed by the closing summarizing statement of the evangelist of the purpose of the gospel and its achievement, which ends with a clear conclusion, not only to the Paschal mystery, but to the gospel as a whole. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe, and that believing you may have life in his name, seems to bring the gospel to a theological and literary close. But then the story seems to reopen, start all over again. A new chapter, chapter 21, begins with, "Now after this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way." And it proceeds to today's account, an amazing and mysterious episode that sounds like a Johannized version of the synoptic story from the public life of Jesus of a miraculous catch of fish by the disciples casting their nets as Jesus, standing on the shore, directs them to do. This Johannine fish story, the disciples' ensuing breakfast on the shore with a mysteriously recognizable but otherworldly Jesus, Jesus' threefold questioning and rehabilitation of Simon Peter, who had betrayed Jesus 3 times during the Passion, Jesus' commissioning of Peter to feed Jesus, not Peter's, lambs and sheep, Jesus' firm resolution of the ambiguous relationship between Simon Peter and the beloved disciple, with whom Peter had been at least somewhat unfavorably contrasted throughout most of John's gospel, and of whom Peter in this episode is clearly still jealous, and the prediction of the ongoing witness of both disciples, Peter by bloody martyrdom, and the beloved disciple by his witness until Jesus comes again, constitute a kind of gospel in miniature. And then there's a second conclusion, clearly echoing the conclusion in the previous chapter, at the end of chapter 20, to the gospel as a whole. Now there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. So what is going on here? Some commentators suggest that there was a final redactor or editor of the fourth gospel who simply added some loose material that didn't fit into the main body of the gospel, resolved some ambiguities left hanging from the first 20 chapters, and then wrote a rather clumsy concluding verse based on the one at the end of chapter 20 and stuck it on the end of chapter 21. In other words, the gospel ends twice because there was some extra material that someone didn't think should be omitted. Others suggest that sometime after the end of chapter 20, Simon Peter and the beloved disciple had both died, and it was felt necessary to write a kind of conclusion to the lifetime of the original disciples. Chapter 21, these commentators hypothesized, is that second conclusion to the gospel. But I have always had a, I hope, professionally well-founded opinion that it is always best to start with the hypothesis that the text, the scriptural text, as we have it, is the authentic one because it is the canonical one. And especially so in a case like this, in which the hypothesized original text, John 1 to 20, never circulated as far as we know without this chapter 21. So I pose the question, if we take this text, John 21, as the original and intended last chapter of the gospel, what could it mean? And how does it complete the gospel as a whole? And for our purposes, bring us, the readers, to a point of resolution, which definitively moves us into the long post-Paschal liturgical year. The first thing to note about this appearance in Galilee is the change of atmosphere. This scene on the shore of the sea is more ethereal and paradoxically more ordinary than the Easter appearances in chapter 20. We are in the period sometime after the resurrection appearances had apparently ended. Jesus, bodily risen, is no longer among them. The disciples, still perhaps uncertain about what comes next, at Peter's suggestion, decide to go fishing, to return to their pre-Jesus lives, to the ordinary, the everyday atmosphere and business of earning their living. From this point of view, the chapter seems to be a kind of come down from the exalted atmosphere of the appearances in chapter 20. We are back to business as usual, fishing. It could even suggest an abandonment of the apostolic commission given in the second half of the resurrection narrative, a resignation to the apparent fact that the Jesus thing, however personally transformative it was, is over, ended by the cross and the risen Jesus' apparently definitive disappearance from their midst. The second thing we note is the cast of characters. Simon Peter and the beloved disciples are staples of John's gospel. Indeed, with the Samaritan woman and Mary Magdalene, they are the four main characters after Jesus himself. So we're still in the context of the Johannine community, the community of the fourth gospel. Two other Johannine characters who appear only in the fourth gospel are in the group who set out to fish. The first is Thomas the twin, who is the last disciple the risen Jesus spoke to on Sunday night, 1 week after Easter, and to whom Jesus said, "You believe, Thomas, because you have seen. Blessed those not seeing and believing." In other words, Thomas is the spiritual twin, a double character himself on the one hand, and our twin on the other. The link between the generation who went about with Jesus in his public life and participated in his paschal mystery, and those of us down through the ages who never saw the earthly Jesus, nor the Easter Jesus, but who believe without seeing. The other named Johannine character in the fishing boat is Nathanael, who appears only in John's gospel, who was the first disciple to come to Jesus, led by someone other than the baptizer or Jesus himself, namely Philip. Jesus named Nathanael, whose name means gift of God, as the true Israelite without guile, the one who replaces the perfidious Jacob Israel of the Old Testament, who stole his birthright from his twin brother Esau. Nathanael is the new Israel, given to Jesus as the first member of the new spouse of the new covenant. In other words, through its cast of characters, this scene at the Sea of Tiberias has one foot in the lifetime of the earthly Jesus that began in the incarnation, announced in the prologue of the Gospel of John, and 1 foot in the church, the new body of Christ that is born from the resurrection, the church that we are and are part of. But thirdly, the group in the boat on the Sea of Tiberias includes the sons of Zebedee, that is James and John, who appear nowhere as such in John's gospel. So some kind of connection is being made between the Johannine church, led by the beloved disciple and composed of a symbolic group particular to this gospel, and the so-called larger church, led by Simon Peter, in which the sons of Zebedee play a major role. In other words, between the church of the beloved disciple, which is somewhat idiosyncratic, and what has been called the great church, or the mainline early church of the synoptic gospels, in which the sons of Zebedee, James and John with Peter, are the leadership triumvirate. And then we are told that there were two other disciples, anonymous Christians of the first generation or later, who perhaps represent all of us down through the ages, who were not present for the earthly life of Jesus, nor for the resurrection appearances, but who formed the church throughout subsequent history, carrying on the great fishing expedition, the work of Jesus throughout history that will last to the end of time. In short, this mysterious scene presents us with a sketch of the church of which we are a part, led by Peter, tracing itself back to both the church of the beloved disciple, which is now united to that of Peter, even while maintaining its distinctiveness, fishing from the same boat in the same waters, but having different strands of historical influence, different faces, as it were, that of Peter and that of other churches like the community of the beloved disciple and the others. Like the church of today, the great church embraces both Jesus' first generation eyewitness disciples and others like us who were not there when Jesus walked the earth. There is something mysterious and liminal about this scene. It is not a straightforward historical fishing expedition, nor is it unreal, a dream without substance. The fishermen who have labored all night have caught nothing, but they see a mysterious, indistinct, but unmistakably real figure on the shore, whom the beloved disciple authoritatively discerns and names. It is the Lord. Jesus questions them about their catch, and when they admit that they have caught nothing, which is always the case when we fish, however skillfully without Jesus, he tells them to cast their net to the other side of the boat. They obey, and the nets are filled to bursting with fish, but the nets mysteriously remain intact, unbroken. One has to wonder about these numerous fish who perceptibly swam on one side of the boat to avoid being caught. This almost humorous detail, along with the exact count of the fish caught, 153 of them to be precise, alerts the reader to the symbolic character of the story. Commentators down through the ages have recognized in this overloaded but untorn net a symbol, like that of Jesus' untorn cloak on Calvary, of the unity of the church, which is not due to the fishers or the shepherds, but to the one on the shore who gave the command to fish, and will, in a moment, give Peter the command to feed and tend. In one sense, things are as they were when Jesus was with them. In another sense, everything is mysteriously different. It is like our experience. We recognize in our Christian lives the events described in the gospel, and yet we are not in the first century. And the Jesus of our experience is not the Galilean preacher, but the risen Lord, mysteriously and simultaneously present and absent in our everyday lives. This chapter, John 21, is divided into two parts. In the first part, verses 1 to 14, we have the miraculous catch of fish and the recognition of the Lord as mysteriously but really present to them, guiding their labors, blessing their catch, feeding them from their own nets with his own hand. In this first part, we see the two complementary apostolic roles of the church. The contemplative attention of the beloved disciple who recognizes and proclaims the Lord, mysteriously present to and among us in our everyday mundane lives. The active ministerial cooperation of the disciples with Jesus, who is the true fisher of humans. Those with historical names and those without names, who have joined the original disciples down through the years and the centuries, and who at Jesus' command and under Simon Peter's leadership, but only at Jesus' initiative, catch a huge number of fish and haul the catch ashore, where Jesus consecrates their, that is our labor, and its fruits in a communion meal. We are told that this was the third time the risen Jesus had appeared to his disciples. The attentive reader will realize that the first time was Easter night. The second time was a week later, again on Sunday night, in an obviously ecclesial but still paschal setting. This third time is in a different dispensation, that of post-Easter time. In other words, it is ordinary time, ecclesial time, our time. Jesus is no less real, no less active in our lives, but he is present in a different way, a mysterious way. And in a sense, it is now they, that is us, who must make Jesus present by our recognition of him, our proclaiming of him, our carrying on of his great fishing expedition, catching the fish he places in our nets, our participation in the Eucharistic meal, on all the shores of Christian experience, which will go on until the end of time. The second part of the chapter, verses 15 to 23, is the painfully touching scene in which Jesus rehabilitates Simon Peter, who had denied him 3 times during the Passion. Jesus asks Peter 3 times, once again at a charcoal fire, like the one at which Peter had warmed himself while denying Jesus in the courtyard of the high priest during Jesus' trial. Now, Jesus' question, "Do you love me?" reframes the question of the servant girl, "Are you his disciple?" Now, as Peter, in deepening shame and contrition, professes 3 times his ever weak and wavering but ardent love for the one he had thrice denied even knowing, Jesus commissions Peter to feed and tend Jesus' flock. Jesus does not give the flock to Peter or put Peter in his own place as the good shepherd. The flock belongs always, only, and in every way, and in every time and place to Jesus, not to Peter. But Peter, now deeply conscious of how fickle, unfaithful, unworthy, and unstable he is of himself, is spiritually grown up enough to be entrusted by Jesus to care for Jesus' flock. And Jesus can foretell to Peter that he will have the chance to wash away his unfaithfulness with his own blood, which in final faithfulness he will shed for Jesus, mingling his shepherd's blood with the blood of the good shepherd whose cross he will share. In the second part of this second scene, verses 20 to 23, the spiritual rivalry in the 4th gospel between Simon Peter and the beloved disciple, which very possibly is a literary trace of a real tension in the early church between the community of the beloved disciple, probably based somewhere in Asia Minor, and the community of Simon Peter, based somewhere, perhaps Rome, more centrally to the early Christian movement as a whole. The question arises about this probably very distinctive early Christian church of the beloved disciple. Does it need to be folded into the larger mainstream of the newborn church? Should there be only one authority in the church, namely Peter's? Jesus, when Peter asks, "What about him?" that is the beloved disciple, says that if he, Jesus, wants the community of the beloved disciple to flourish, to remain until Jesus comes again, that is not Peter's business. Peter has more than enough to do to be faithful to his own calling without worrying about that of others. Jesus tells Peter, in effect, to mind his own pastoral business. Jesus will see to the community of the beloved disciple, but not apparently by wiping it out or by subordinating it without remainder to Peter. If Jesus wishes it to remain, which it does in the gospel we are reading, that is not Peter's business or worry. Perhaps we need to meditate on this scene today when various movements in the church seem more concerned with recognizing and following Jesus than about being approved of by Rome, while Rome seems sometimes more concerned about lines of command and mechanisms of control than about the authentic following of Jesus. In any case, what we can derive from this scene, mysteriously rooted in the post-resurrection reality of the risen Jesus, and at the same time unrolling in a liminal in-between time that is neither that of the pre-Easter Jesus of Palestine, nor that of the post-Easter Jesus of the 40 days, but in the experience of the Lord of all time between the resurrection and the eschaton. It is a time rooted in the remembered and celebrated life of the historical Jesus, subsumed in the time of the resurrection, and unfolding in ordinary time down through the ages. It is a time in which the contemplative mystical vocation of recognizing the Lord, wherever he appears and acts, expected or not, and proclaiming his identity, his presence, his work among us in every moment of every day, partners with the ministerial vocation of the catch, which is never a completed task. It is the time when the beloved disciple in each of us must rest assured that we are preferentially loved, called to remain until Jesus comes again, and that we belong to him and not to anyone else, even to a Peter, and especially when such a one forgets that he is tending Jesus' sheep, not his own. And we must recognize also the Peter in ourselves, the one capable of deep betrayal, called to a ministry as strenuous as the hauling in of overloaded nets, empowered for an ever-renewed catch, strengthened to tend Jesus' flock and extend it, even if it leads to our death in imitation of Jesus. So in summary and conclusion, I've tried to show how John's resurrection narrative can serve as a resource for a renewed paschal ecclesiology of the 21st century and the building up of the church of the present, struggling now in ordinary time, for the future, the eschaton whose time we do not know. John's resurrection narrative opened with the story of a woman, Mary Magdalene, as first apostle of the risen Jesus, encouraging us to envision and work toward an inclusive church, a church in which women and men share equally in life and mission of the church, and in which the church is not solely teacher or learner, but only not only evangelizer, but evangelized. And in this story of the mysterious catch of fish in the post-Paschal season, we contemplate the complementarity of contemplation and ministry in the ongoing life of the church. We see the necessity of both fidelity to the apostolic tradition represented by Simon Peter, and of the novelty that arises in the day-to-day encounter of the beloved disciple, who we all are, with the living Jesus, who does not simply repeat and urge us to repeat, but who takes the initiative and bids us to do the same. Raymond Brown, probably the greatest English-speaking Johannine scholar of the 20th century and a deeply loyal Catholic, once suggested that what the church of our time really needs is the adventurous ecclesiology of the fourth gospel. I think his insight is even more true today in the age of Francis than it was when Brown said it almost 3 decades ago. What might be possible in a church that is adventurously inclusive and egalitarian, and both profoundly contemplative and imaginatively and powerfully ministerial?